Hello and welcome to our fifth podcast of the People's Press Project discussing immigration. Today's topic will be criminal issues. Criminal issues as in criminal background, criminal history. And today, once again, I have with me Anna Stenson, an immigration lawyer. This is a really difficult topic, Anna, because as we discussed last week, people have to get together certain documentation if they want to apply for the president's new programs of DAPA and DACA. And if people have some kind of criminal history, it could keep them from being eligible. And if they go ahead and apply having these elements in their history, it could get them put into a proceeding to be deported even, right?
That's correct.
So it's pretty important to discuss what kinds of criminal history could get you into trouble. And then, of course, you need to get your records and get someone like an attorney like yourself or somebody that's BIA accredited to review that criminal history and make sure that it's not going to be a barrier for your application or worse, landing you in a proceeding to get you deported, arrested.
Yep, and what even makes it even a little bit more confusing is you can't necessarily go back to your criminal attorney, because if your criminal attorney doesn't do immigration, the way the criminal justice system in the state looks at many of these issues is very different than how immigration looks at these issues. So it becomes a confusing mess.
So immigration, you said this last week, but immigration is going to set a set of standards that they're looking for, both in, heavy crimes like felony crimes, as well as in minor crimes like misdemeanors that they have prioritized as things they're looking for that they do not want to accept in applicants for these programs.
Yes, and it gets confusing because people can be, convicted of a crime at the city level. They can be convicted of a crime at the state level, or they can be convicted of a crime at the federal level. And so each one of those has different rules and different language that they use. But then immigration tries to combine everything to use the same rules for everybody.
Right. So once again, your criminal attorney is not going to be able to tell you what criteria immigration is looking for. And you do have to get all of those different sets of criminal background histories in order to determine whether or not you're going to be eligible and to get the paperwork ready for your application. But first, I want to make a little pit stop to discuss what's happened in the law, because there's been lawsuits and holdups and injunctions, and people are going, what's going on?
Yes, the good question is what's going on, and right now it's really on a day-by-day, week-by-week basis. Part of the problem is that 26 states have sued President Obama and the federal government over the implementation of that expanded DACA and the DAPA program. Mm-hmm. And so last week, the Texas judge put a stop sign up and said, I'm putting an injunction on being able to file these applications. So right now, we can't file those applications. That happened last week. So, of course, this week is a new week and we have something different. So President Obama and, the other side in the case have filed paperwork and motions to say, let's go ahead and to be able to go forward and let these applications go forward. So, of course, the next step is we're going to wait for the judge to come back and decide, are we going to leave that stop sign up, or are we going to go ahead and let these cases go forward? So, again, it's really going to be on a, case-by-case or on a day-by-day, week-by-week basis until this court case is settled.
But eventually, most of the legal scholars and people that are working within immigration understand that this stop sign will be removed, that the process will move forward. It's just a matter of when, really. Is that correct?
Yep, it's really a matter of when. Most of the legal scholars think that this is just a stop sign, a bump in the road, trying to make it a little bit harder and trying to, maybe make it a little bit more difficult to encourage people to come forward. But most legal scholars believe that ultimately, after the court case works itself out, that we'll be able to start filing those DACA and DAPA applications.
So people shouldn't panic and think, oh no, the program isn't going to happen. They should keep gathering their paperwork and getting ready.
Yep, keep gathering the paperwork, especially when we talk about complex issues like the criminal issues. Now's the time to focus on making sure that you get all of your paperwork and everything ready so that when you can start filing these applications, you have a complete application and are ready to go. And of course, saving that money to pay the filing fee and to pay if you do need to consult with somebody about particular issues in your case.
So, getting back to the criminal history thing, this is a very complicated issue, as we were just discussing, because in order to apply for DACA and DAPA, you're going to have certain criminal elements in your history that are going to prevent you from being eligible. And I wanted you to kind of cover what people should be looking for. If you've had these types of criminal contacts, there should be an evaluation of your case, of your application beforehand.
Yep. Usually I start with, first try and identify everything that could be a concern and then figure out whether it is a concern. And so that's where I usually go, have you ever been arrested, whether it's by the police, law enforcement, immigration, anybody like that? Because that's a sign you could have an immigration, or you could have a criminal case or a criminal record out there. If you've ever been charged with a crime, even if that case has been dismissed or something else has happened to that case, immigration usually is going to be able to find that or wants to know information about that. If you've ever had to go to court, that's usually, again, a sign that there might be some sort of criminal issue going on. If you've ever had to go to jail, even if it's for an hour, that might usually means that you've been arrested. Even something as simple as a traffic ticket, depending on where, when, how, and what happened to that traffic ticket, could be a trigger for criminal issues.
So for folks out there that think, well, if I wasn't sitting up in the jail, then I shouldn't have to worry about it. Or I just got turned away at the border one time, or that's all part of the criminal history.
Yep, that's going to be all part of the criminal history. And even being turned away from the border, the way immigration documents it could be different in terms of, did they just say, go back home, or did they take your fingerprints and now there's a record, or did they give you paperwork saying you can't come back? Mm-hmm. And so,
well, how about this? What about if the cops were just questioning me because they wanted to know if I was involved in a crime or knew something about a crime, but I didn't, and I was just questioned over this issue, and I didn't go to jail or go to court? Is that still something I got to bring up to you?
Usually I say I kind of want to know those things because your name could be associated with somebody else's record.
Oh.
Or if they do, if immigration does background checks on everybody who files any of these applications, and so better to know up front where your name might pop up, and better to confirm that there's no record, there's nothing out there. I've worked with people too who have been picked up by the police and said, "Oh no, you're fine," and turns out that they had a citation, or that they did have something going on, but they were led to believe it wasn't a big deal.
Is the importance of your criminal history the same for applying for DAPA as it is for DACA, or are there differences?
Well, this is where we've already talked about this whole criminal issues being confusing.
Yeah.
I'm going to make it even more confusing.
Okay.
Because there's going to be slightly different rules for those people who are eligible for DAPA.
Okay. The parents?
And then there's going to be different rules for those who are eligible for DACA.
That's the children.
That's
the
children.
The people that came here as children.
And both of those are different than if somebody wants to get their green card.
Or their citizenship.
They're
different. Oh my God.
Yep. And so one of the reasons, too, you want to seek quality advice is in certain circumstances, somebody might be able to get DAPA or DACA,
mm-hmm.
which then puts them on a path where they could get a green card.
Mm-hmm.
So something that might not affect their eligibility for DACA or DAPA might affect their ability to get a green card down the road.
Oh.
So a lot of different things in the mix. I wish I could say that there was one rule across the board, but that's why it's going to be really important that if you have any criminal issues, to make sure you talk with somebody who can help figure out how it affects whether you're eligible for DAPA or DACA.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm hearing you say is that even if I'm only applying for DACA or DAPA and I've got all my ducks in a row and I got my documentation, it's important to evaluate, if I do have any criminal history, how that might affect other processes that I might want to apply for in the future, like a green card.
Yes.
And they will have different criteria, so it's important to evaluate how having this criminal history as part of my application process might affect the future of any other application I might want to file.
Yes.
Wow. Okay, so let's get into the classifications here for the different crimes for DAPA and DACA. Let's go with the big ones first, the felonies. Talking about the felonies, what do we need to look for there?
And again, there's going to be a slight difference as to how it's defined for DACA and DAPA purposes. DACA usually has said it's an offense punishable by imprisonment for more than 1 year.
Right.
Okay, and that doesn't necessarily mean you've served 1 year in jail. It's that whatever crime you've committed can be punished by a year or more in jail.
Even if you only served like 3 months.
It could be, and again, that's one of those, the language is, punishable by imprisonment for more than 1 year.
Okay.
DAPA has defined it a little bit differently in terms of looking at was it treated as a felony at the state level or at the federal level or at whatever court level you were at.
Okay. So then what about aggravated felonies or...
Okay, well, even though we have this felony thing and we usually say, imprisonment of more than 1 year in jail, immigration uses this term of art that's considered an aggravated felony for immigration purposes. And for aggravated felonies for immigration purposes, that could be actually things that we might consider smaller crimes. Theft offenses, forgery, perjury, obstruction of justice, things that wouldn't meet that first level definition of felony, but something that immigration has labeled a felony.
Okay, and then how about the offenses related to illegal entry into the United States and felonies related to immigration?
Yep, and with that too, if it's a state conviction for an immigration purposes, like the Arizona, show me your papers you didn't show, those types of crimes immigration has said they're not going to treat as felonies,
even though they're felonies.
Okay.
Booyah! That's very good.
However,
don't celebrate yet.
Yes. Now, if you have a federal conviction for a felony conviction for re-entering the U.S. after you've been deported, that counts
as a felony.
And not only does that count as a felony, if you have that in your background, you're going to be higher on that list to being deported.
Wow. That's important for people to know. Because in a case like that, you would probably not want to even file the application. You would probably be put on an immediate deportation proceedings.
Or you'd want to make sure that you have strong, compelling something in your background and that you're willing to help argue and push as to why immigration shouldn't be focusing on that the fact that you have an old deportation order and you re-entered.
Mm. Okay, so now moving on to significant misdemeanors. What is this significant misdemeanor?
Again, this is a term of art that immigration has created just for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And we've known about the aggravated felony language for a while.
Right.
This significant misdemeanor is something that we only have really started to see with the DACA program.
Okay.
And again,
It's not like a list of like these types of crimes. It's like it's got more.
Yeah, and in a sense of they've talked about, it could be a significant misdemeanor if you had to serve 90 days in jail.
Okay.
And that's one where it's important, where if they said, we're going to sentence you to 90 days, but we're going to defer that or suspend that sentence.
The fact that you were sentenced to 90 days is what the criteria is.
Nope. This one is you have to have been in jail for 90 days.
Oh, so unlike the other one, where if you were sentenced for a year, it could be...
Yes.
Regardless of how much you served. For this one, you have to serve the 90 days.
Yes.
Wow, this is very specific.
Yeah. And with DACA, it's 90 days. With DAPA, it's 91 days. Again, this is one of those where, it's confusing for those of us who do this on a daily basis. So, people are going to want to make sure that they're not trying to do this on their own. Because, the difference between one day could be a difference depending on if you are applying for DACA or DAPA.
Mm-hmm. What about domestic violence types of calls and misdemeanors? Are those significant?
Immigration has nicely said that domestic violence crimes are considered significant misdemeanors, but they haven't really defined what they consider a domestic violence conviction to be a significant misdemeanor.
Okay.
So it's one of those where, immigration is using these terminology about not having a conviction, or if you have a conviction for domestic violence, for it being a significant misdemeanor, but they don't necessarily back it up with this is exactly what we consider to be.
So it's kind of nebulous.
Yes.
It's kind of nebulous. It's going to a case-by-case basis type of situation.
Case-by-case basis.
What about sexual abuse or misconduct?
Yep, sexual abuse or exploitation. Again, this is one where they use these terminologies, but haven't really defined or put parameters as to what's going to be in and what's going to be out.
So any kind of conviction where somebody has to register as a sex offender or has any kind of sexual connotation to the conviction could constitute...
Could be in there too. Even in terms of sexual abuse or exploitation, if you have some sort of crime against a minor, whether it's maybe child abuse or something, depending on how they're defining that, could
endangerment of a minor, things like that. Yep. That could be a significant misdemeanor. Possibly. Okay.
Yep.
How about use of weapons or firearms and that type of types of
the unlawful possession or use of a firearm, or even maybe if you're convicted of a crime that has an element of a firearm, those are things that can get it elevated up to that significant misdemeanor category.
So are immigration people looking at those types of firearm related or weapons related charges as being more dangerous, more higher on their priorities list, do you think?
I think to the extent, again, for the most part, if it's a significant misdemeanor, you start to need to be concerned, as to where your offense is going to fall on that priority chart.
And of course, hand in hand with that goes drug charges. How damaging are those? I mean, we're starting to decriminalize some of the drugs in this country, but what's immigration going to look at this?
Well, and immigration kind of breaks it down between, drug sales or distribution,
right,
and personal use,
possession,
and the possession. So, drug sales, drug distribution is going to fall in that significant misdemeanor. The drugs, the personal possession of drugs are hopefully not going to be in that significant misdemeanor category.
Mm-hmm. And how will any drug possessions or charges against you affect your ability to get a green card or apply for citizenship in the future?
That's one of the things when we talked about before about, misdemeanor drug possession doesn't prevent you from getting DAPA or DAPA now. However, having those drug possession charges can affect your ability to get a green card in the future.
It can?
Yes.
Wow.
And so that's one, just because you think you might be safe for DACA or DAPA doesn't mean you might be safe.
No plans in the future but from INS, like decriminalizing the drug possession element?
Well,
we can hope.
Well, we can hope, but first we have to get beyond the roadblock that's in the way.
Yes, that's right. Okay, how about like theft, burglaries, or like DUIs, that type of charge? Those are kind of common.
Well, burglary charges, they're going to look at, and that's going to be one. What were the circumstances?
Like somebody wrote a bad check.
That writing a bad check probably won't be a problem. Some shoplifting convictions might be a problem. That's one where, there's not necessarily a bright white line when it comes to, theft and shoplifting and burglary charges. Now, there is a pretty bright line with DUIs and DWIs.
Yeah.
Even though we might consider them pretty minor and that lots of people have DUI and DWI charges, immigration treats those as significant misdemeanors.
So that would be one of those big barrier things.
That's going to be one of those big barrier things.
So all of these things are things you have to really, if you have any contact with police, definitely check out with an expert like yourself. Let's move on to the misdemeanor category. This is the simplest crime. What are the kinds of misdemeanors that, public urination? I'm wondering, what are they looking for?
Well, and for DACA purposes, they've said any three or more misdemeanors, no matter what type they are, as long as they're misdemeanors.
So if you got 3 misdemeanors or more, it's bad.
Yes.
You got to get. You have to check it out.
Yes.
Now, some of these things can be, like if you have some minor offenses in your criminal history, they might be able to get expunged, or there may be some things that immigration attorneys can help you with to clear that up, right?
Yep. And we'll kind of go back even within the misdemeanors. There are some things that immigration has said they're not going to counter focus on, and that's things like driving without a license, because we realize that most of the people who are going to qualify for DACA and DAPA don't have any ID and they don't have legal status, so they in most places can't even get a driver's license. So if all you have are minor traffic offenses, speeding tickets, as long as they're not drug or alcohol related,
right,
those are not going to count towards that, those 3 misdemeanors. Kind of talking about that, getting an expungement. And again, this is going to be one where, depending on your particular circumstance or case, going in and getting an expungement could help. Maybe. If you can go back in and get a reduction in your sentence, that could help. And that's one of those, there might be things working with a criminal attorney and an immigration attorney that can be done that could help your ability to get DACA or DAPA.
Okay. And let's talk a little bit about the exceptions, depending on, because we were talking a little bit earlier before the show about the difference between a misdemeanor and an infraction. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, it's one of we've been kind of working our way down the list in terms of how the system looks at different types of criminal activity. And usually at the lowest level, is misdemeanors, but it kind of even below that are things like traffic tickets, which are usually considered citations. But even within that, some cities issue infractions. So it looks very much like a criminal case because you go into court, there's a judge there, but in terms of the penalty, you can't be sentenced to jail time, or you don't have the right to a jury trial. And so things like infractions might not even be considered even a misdemeanor. Right.
Again, these are things you need to check out with someone that knows the difference between these types of offenses. And what is the categorization, the specific categorization given by DAPA and by DACA to the word misdemeanor? Like how many fine amount or J's in jail or what?
Usually for DACA purposes, they've said you have to have a minimum punishment of 5 days in jail. So kind of going back to that, if you're looking at an infraction that doesn't have any jail time, then that's not going to meet that definition for a misdemeanor. And so for DACA purposes, they've said, punishment between 5 days in jail and less than 1 year in jail. Mm-hmm. Now for DAPA, since that's a newer program, we haven't heard yet.
Oh, there's no guidelines exactly for what the misdemeanor...
No guidelines yet as to exactly how they're going to define that.
Okay, and we also talked about gang relation. What exactly does that mean? I'm assuming that if you got arrested involving some kind of gang element, that's going to be part of the criminal history stuff that's already there. What is exactly the gang element?
Yes, when it comes to immigration, it'd be nice to say that all we have to worry about is if you've had a conviction or you've been arrested. Mm-hmm. But immigration also has these rules about activity that might not rise to the level of being arrested or convicted of a crime. So immigration, when it comes to the DAPA and DACA, have talked about not having any gang-related activities and no terroristic activities. And so that, they're looking for, do you have any actions or conduct in your background that are going to make them believe that you might be participating in gang activity or terrorist activity?
Like what?
Well, and that's a good question in terms of it's going to depend on the area of the country that you're in. But it's one of those, if you think that, if you're in a gang, you probably want to talk to an attorney to make sure that, to have that addressed and to figure out what kind of proof there is of that. Mm-hmm. But it might be, too, that there's going to be some people where immigration might come back and say, we think you're involved in gang activity. And then you're going to have to go and try and disprove that you're not in activity.
Okay.
And sometimes I talk about, call it guilt by association. I mean, if you were involved in a group and other people and your friends were picked up and they were charged with gang-related activity,
And is that true for both programs? If you have any gang-related activity?
Well, right now, DACA hasn't been focused so much on the gang-related activity. Okay. But it looks like for DAPA purposes, and with all of these things, even if having gang-related activity doesn't stop you from applying for DACA or DAPA, it's a factor that immigration consider in that case-by-case basis. Mm-hmm. And that's one where if especially
and are certain gangs, participation within certain gangs as opposed to others. More important to immigration? Is that an element of... like if you're in the Crips or the Bloods, is that going to be more scary than Salva Maratrucha or something like that?
Right now, they're just saying gang-related activity. So, okay. Internally when they're looking at, they might be ranking,
right.
what type of gang it is. But, and that's one of those, even if they can't deny you DACA or DAPA for any of these activities, they can still consider those activities when they're deciding whether or not they're going to give you DACA or DAPA.
Whether or not you pose a threat.
Yes.
Okay. So it has to do with whether or not you pose a threat to national security or public safety.
Yes.
Primarily.
Yes.
Okay. We also talked about terrorism, national security. What are the differences there between what DAPA and DACA are looking for with regard to terrorism?
Well, and again, that's one where, all of the rules for DAPA isn't out yet, but they've started hinting at there's going to be slightly different definitions of what they're looking for, for terrorist activity in between the two. So if you think there's something there to be said that, that you're a threat to the national security, that's one where you're going to want to get some extra advice and to figure out how immigration is going to look at you.
Okay. Now, what if you have somebody that's already had something expunged or It was from their juvenile days. When they were kids, they got, arrested or whatever.
Yeah, and again,
is that going to count?
Well, for DACA purposes, they said an expunged conviction, your juvenile convictions, doesn't automatically disqualify you for DACA or DAPA purposes. But again, that's one where immigration is going to want to see that information so they can make that case-by-case determination to see, call it how bad was your juvenile history, or, what bad thing did you do as a juvenile.
Okay. So if you're tried as an adult, it's even if you were like 18 years old at the time, or 16 years old, depending on the state where you lived.
Yep. Even if you were juvenile at the time that you committed the offense, but you went through the adult court system, you're going to be treated as an adult. You're not going to get that juvenile protection.
Okay, so if you have any criminal convictions, you need to check with an attorney to see if you can expunge, vacate, modify your conviction, working together with a criminal attorney, of course.
Yep, and again, each state and each jurisdiction where you've had that criminal offense has different rules. And so in some places you might no longer be eligible to have it expunged.
Right.
Or sometimes having it expunged might not necessarily help your ability to qualify for DACA or DAPA.
Right.
And so that's one where, just because you had a conviction that was expunged or vacated.
Yeah, like we just discussed.
In the state system doesn't mean that immigration is not going to count that against you.
Mm-hmm. So you still have to check with an attorney.
Still have to check.
And why don't we give folks your number in case they want to ask you about these complicated questions? How can people get a hold of Ann Stenson?
My phone number is 701-298-7720.
Fantastic. Now, the last time we talked about documents, I want to quickly go over what kinds of documents do we need to collect for our criminal records.
And this is one, again, too, especially if you're going to come in and see me or another attorney or another qualified person, they're going to want to see as much information about what has went on as possible. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean you give all that information to immigration, but it gives us a better understanding of where you're going to fit into these classifications. So arrest reports, court records, even if it's background checks because you don't remember. I know that I might have been pulled over by the police, 15 years ago in Nebraska, but I don't remember what happened. Well, you might want to get a background check done to figure out what information is out there, because we do know that immigration is going to run background checks on you. So better to have your homework done up front than to be surprised about what might be in your record.
So I go and I try to collect all the records that I know about, or how to get anyway. What if I don't know how to get a background check done and I know that I have some criminal background history? Can you help me with that?
That's something that I can help with. Oftentimes if somebody comes in and says, how do I find this stuff? I have a list of where to go in each state to try and get those, to do those background checks. And I usually do, let's do a national background check too. Mm-hmm. So I do provide that information so people can go and get those records and then bring them back to me so I can look at them and help them out. So
if folks getting ready for the DACA or the DAPA application process, you need to be collecting your records. You need to get your money together. It's $465. Yep. So $465 per person. And you need to get your criminal background checks done. If you don't know how, call Anna, call an attorney, figure out how to get those records, because you're going to have to go over them before you file your application. Thank you for talking to us again about criminal activity and our background in the process of applying for DACA and DAPA. And we will be back with you folks in a week, bringing you more information about immigration. Thank you. This is Cindy Gomez-Schempp, and you've just listened to a podcast of the People's Press Project. We will be hosting a series of podcasts discussing topics related to the President's announcement on immigration, which will be broadcast in English and Spanish. Please share them and help us spread the word. To find out more information about this or other podcasts and online media, visit our websites at fmppp.org, mexi-can.org, or like and follow us on Facebook at the People's Press Project, Mexi-Can, and find us on Twitter at media_PPP.